Rook's last case. On the day they moved into the Texas farmhouse, Miriam told herself they were done with emergency rooms and whispered instructions. The porch smelled of sun-heated wood and wild rye. Daniel carried boxes. Caleb tucked himself behind a chair, and the dog, Rook, once a canine with a badge, now a retiree with a knowing gaze, paced the rooms like a veteran counting exits. He didn't bark. He listened. He lingered at thresholds, nose lifting as if the walls were speaking softly. That first night, lightning walked the horizon. Caleb, who had learned to be silent when the world turned loud, slid his hand into the thick ruff at Rook's neck. The old shepherd lay down, a quiet weight, and for the first time in months, the boy slept through thunder. 5 weeks later, the house had learned their footsteps. The kettle's whistle felt like a friend. Then came the morning of the mirror, the unused bathroom, the door half closed, and that sudden, disciplined bark that made Miriam drop a basket of clean shirts. Rook was not a dog prone to drama. He was a creature of evidence. He stood before the glass with a patience that sounded like warning. Caleb's voice, small, careful, found its way back to air. "He's in there." And for the first time since the move, Miriam realized Rook might not be retired at all. Maybe he was still working, only now the case was theirs. It began as laundry. A basket of folded towels and sun-worn shirts cradled in Miriam Ellis's arms, as she hummed quietly to herself. The late afternoon light slanting golden across the floorboards of the old farmhouse. It was a peaceful soundscape, birds outside, the dryer's gentle click from down the hall, and the occasional soft creak of aged pine wood beneath her bare feet. Ordinary. Safe. Then came the bark. It wasn't the kind of bark that broke up backyard stillness or greeted the mailman. It wasn't the excited yip of a game, or the warning woof Rook used when he saw a coyote near the fence line. This bark came from deep in the chest, low, urgent, almost primal. Miriam froze mid-step. The laundry basket tilted and collapsed to the floor, spilling a sun-creased t-shirt across her foot. She didn't even notice. There it was again. A second bark, this one sharper, more desperate. It echoed from upstairs. Her mouth went dry. "Rook," she called, already stepping out of her slippers. "Caleb!" No answer. She was moving before her brain had fully caught up, her body gripped by a mother's fear that lived somewhere beneath logic, in the bones. She climbed the stairs 2 at a time, her hand grazing the banister for balance. The house creaked around her, a deep, hollow groan that old houses made when something wasn't right. Another bark. It came from the guest bathroom, the one at the end of the hall. It. The wood felt cold. "Rook," she said, voice soft, uncertain. There was a pause. Then a thud, the sound of paws slamming the tiled floor. A low growl followed, vibrating through the wood like a threat or a plea. She turned the knob. The door creaked open slowly. The bathroom was still, empty in its own way. The pale green tiles were clean, untouched. A small bar of soap rested neatly in its dish. The window was cracked open, letting in the scent of dry grass and pine. But none of that mattered. Rook stood in the center of the room. He wasn't barking anymore. He was frozen, his body stiff, tail low, but not tucked, ears sharp, the way he used to look when facing down a suspect back in his service days. His entire focus was on the wall-length mirror above the sink. He let out a guttural growl, low and gravelly, his muscles coiled like a spring. At his side, almost hidden by the size of him, was Caleb. Barefoot, still in his quiet clothes from that morning, a soft blue shirt and corduroy pants. He stood like a shadow next to the dog. One tiny hand gripped tightly around Rook's collar. Miriam's breath caught. "Caleb," she whispered, stepping into the room. The boy didn't move. His eyes were locked on the mirror, wide, unblinking. There was something hollow in them, something that hadn't been there the day before, or maybe it had, and she just hadn't noticed. Then he spoke, barely above a whisper. "He's in there." Miriam blinked. "What?" He didn't look at her, didn't move, just repeated, "He's in there." A chill ran down her spine. She felt it travel up her arms, raising the fine hairs along her neck. She crouched slowly, careful not to startle either of them. She reached out to touch Caleb's arm. It was cold. "Sweetheart, who's in there?" He said nothing more. Rook let out another low rumble. His nails scratched against the tile in slow, deliberate motions, as if trying to dig beneath it or through it. His nose pointed unwaveringly at the mirror. Miriam followed his gaze. The mirror looked normal at first, just glass, reflecting the three of them, woman, child, dog, but there was something wrong with it. She couldn't name it, not exactly. Maybe it was the lighting, or the angle, or how Caleb's reflection looked a little too pale, too thin. A pulse of nausea, vain. It hadn't been there before. Downstairs, Miriam sat with Caleb on the living room couch, Rook curling tightly at the boy's feet, resting his head on Caleb's ankles like a guard who would never again look away. Miriam stared at the hallway shadows. The sun was beginning to dip behind the trees. The house was quiet again, but something had changed. She could feel it. The house had settled into silence again, but it wasn't the kind of silence that comforts. It was the thick, uneasy kind, the kind that presses against the ribs and makes a person listen too closely to the spaces between heartbeats. Miriam moved about the kitchen with deliberate slowness, making tea she wouldn't drink. The kettle hissed softly on the stove, its sound almost drowned by the way her thoughts rustled louder than any steam. Rook hadn't left Caleb's side since they'd come downstairs. The boy sat cross-legged on the couch, a blanket wrapped around his narrow frame, his eyes fixed on nothing. Rook lay at his feet, massive and unmoving, his breathing slow but not relaxed, ears still half perked, as if waiting for another sound from above. Miriam leaned against the counter, hands clasped so tightly the knuckles turned white. She kept seeing the mirror, or rather, what she couldn't quite name about it. It was just a mirror. Just glass and silver backing and an old wooden frame. But something about it had stirred something low and uneasy in her gut, like staring into water that seemed still until you noticed the ripple. She blinked, realizing the kettle had begun to whistle. She turned off the burner, poured water into a mug, and forgot to drop in the tea bag. Behind her, a soft creak. She turned. Caleb stood in the hallway again. Her heart jumped. "Honey?" He didn't answer, just stared up the stairs. She set the mug down too quickly, sloshing water over the counter's edge. "Caleb, sweetheart, come here." Still nothing. But Rook moved. The dog's head lifted slowly from the couch cushion, then the rest of him followed, fluid, quiet. His tail didn't wag. He walked with purpose past the kitchen island, brushed against Miriam's hip, and took the stairs without hesitation. Caleb followed close behind. Miriam hesitated for only a second before going after them. Something in her chest tightened. Not quite fear, not yet, but the kind of pressure that comes before a storm, a warning written in bone. Upstairs, the air felt colder, though the windows were shut. The old wood of the hallway floor groaned softly under her steps. At the far end, the door to the guest bathroom stood ajar. She reached it just as Caleb slipped inside. Rook was already there, growling again. But this time the growl was different. Less like aggression, more like resistance. He wasn't warning anything outside the room. He was pushing something back. Like the sound itself was meant to keep whatever it was at bay. He was standing close to the mirror, front paws spread, head low, tail still. Miriam's eyes flicked to Caleb, who had crouched beside him, hand once again gripping the thick fur of Rook's neck. The boy's face was pale, but calm in a way that didn't feel right. It wasn't serenity, it was resignation, like he'd already seen what was in the mirror before, and had simply accepted it. "Caleb," Miriam said, her voice catching. "Come here, baby." His eyes stayed on the glass, and then he whispered again, "He's in there." Miriam moved closer. She knelt beside them, close enough now to hear Rook's growl vibrating through the floor tiles. Her hand hovered briefly over Caleb's shoulder before resting lightly. "Who's in there?" she asked. Caleb didn't answer. His reflection in the mirror stared back at her, expressionless, blue eyes wide. Miriam turned to the mirror fully. It looked like any old mirror at first glance, a little dusty around the edges, speckled with age in one corner. But as she studied it, really looked at it, she felt something tug at the back of her neck. It wasn't the mirror itself. It was the way it felt like it was watching. A strange thing that a mirror is meant to reflect, but this one seemed to pull. Her gaze drifted downward, and that's when she saw it. A thin line in the glass, not quite a crack, more like a seam, barely visible. It stretched diagonally from the lower left corner, no longer than an inch or two. But it hadn't been there yesterday. She was sure of it. She reached out, tentatively, and touched the glass with the tip of her finger. It was cold, much colder than the room. Behind her, Rook barked, a single, sharp burst. She startled, hand withdrawing, pulse racing. "Okay," she said quietly. "That's enough." She gathered Caleb into her arms, lifting him gently. He didn't resist, but he didn't look at her either. His gaze stayed locked on the mirror, even as his head came to rest against her shoulder. Rook followed them out, but only after giving the mirror one last look, a low huff escaping his chest. Disapproval, distrust. Back in Caleb's room, Miriam tucked him under the quilt, brushing hair from his forehead. "Try to sleep, baby," she whispered. "I'm right here." Rook lay at the foot of the bed, alert. Miriam turned out the light and sat on the edge of the bed, watching the outline of the dog in the half-dark. She wanted to believe it was nothing, just old glass, just imagination, just trauma bleeding into the corners of reality. But the way Caleb had said it, "He's in there," and the way Rook had reacted, that wasn't nothing, it wasn't. She sat there long after Caleb had closed his eyes, long after Rook's growl had faded into pressing in from the upstairs bathroom. There was just the boy. His name was Caleb, 4 years old, no known middle name, leash in Daniel's hand, and said, "If he doesn't work out, call me. But honestly, he's not meant for kennels." The dog was massive, black and tan German shepherd, eyes like burnt gold. He didn't bark, didn't whimper, just stood still, watching everyone like he was still on duty. Caleb refused to come out of his room for hours after Rook arrived. He'd seen a dog and backed away, trembling. Not from fear, Miriam thought, but from memory. She didn't press. They kept Rook on the porch that night, curled on a faded blanket under the swing. He didn't complain. He didn't pace. He just watched the moon rise like he was waiting for someone who never showed. But the next morning things shifted. Caleb was already downstairs when Miriam came in from the garden. He was sitting in the hallway just outside the screen door. The boy hadn't spoken a word in days. But now he sat quietly, legs crossed, staring at the dog through the mesh. Rook didn't move, just blinked once. Caleb raised one hand, slow, cautious, and pressed his palm to the screen. Rook stood, stretched, and walked over. He didn't bark, he didn't sniff. He just pressed his nose to the same spot, matching the boy's gesture. Neither of them flinched. By the following afternoon, they were inseparable. Caleb didn't speak, but he followed Rook everywhere, sat beside him during meals, even if he didn't eat, slept curled near him during afternoon naps. Once Miriam found them in the living room, Caleb with his head resting on Rook's back, both of them breathing in sync, like they'd known each other in some other life. Daniel leaned against the doorframe, arms folded. "You see that?" he said. "I see it," Miriam replied, voice thick. "Kid doesn't talk to us, doesn't even look at us. But that dog?" Daniel shook his head. "It's like he knows what's inside him." Rook didn't behave like a regular dog. He never begged, never chewed, never wandered. He moved like something trained to read shadows before they arrived. Miriam started to wonder if Rook had seen the same kind of darkness that Caleb had. Not in the same way, but maybe close enough. She asked the vet once during a routine checkup. The woman had shrugged, rubbing Rook's ears. Dogs remember smells, fear, blood, violence. Some of them carry things longer than people do. They just don't have words for it. Caleb didn't either, but he had Rook. And sometimes, just sometimes, that was enough. The farmhouse wasn't beautiful, not in the way people think of beauty when they imagine fresh paint and wraparound porches framed by porch swings and golden hour sunlight. No, this house had lived. It sagged a little on the west side, felt like theirs. They hadn't come to it in joy, they'd come in retreat. The house had belonged to Daniel's uncle, Wendell Ellis, a wiry old man with more stories than visitors and a fondness for silent days on his back porch with black coffee and no company. He died in his sleep in late January. No funeral, no heirs, except Daniel. A lawyer called 3 weeks later. The house and land were theirs if they wanted it. 12 acres, mostly mesquite and cedar brush. An old cattle fence that hadn't seen livestock in decades. A red barn leaning west like it had given up mid-step. Miriam didn't even ask. She packed boxes before Daniel had said yes out loud. It wasn't just the grief. It wasn't just Caleb. It was everything that had come before, the months of hospital visits, the whispered prayers that stuck in her throat, the foster systems that chewed children down to silence. They needed a place that didn't echo with old pain. They needed a place without history, or so she thought. The day they arrived, the wind came hard off the plains. Dry, sharp, carrying the scent of earth baked too long under sun. The truck tires crunched gravel up the long driveway, and dust followed them all the way to the front porch, like a ghost, too curious to let go. Caleb hadn't spoken a word since the night before. He clutched a worn cloth bag in his lap, containing nothing but 3 broken crayons, a child-sized sweater that didn't fit, and the ragged stuffed turtle that had survived every home before this one. Miriam had turned in her seat to offer a smile as the house came into view. "Look, Caleb, that's home now." He blinked once, said nothing. Rook sat beside him, panting quietly, gaze fixed on the front of the house like he was sizing it up, memorizing the windows. They moved in slowly. No rush, no noise. Daniel lifted each box like it was made of glass. Miriam wiped down windows that hadn't been touched in years. They found old dishes in the cabinets, faded curtains still clinging to sun-cracked rods, a shoebox of letters tucked in the hallway closet, written in looping cursive no one could read anymore. Some of it they threw away, some they kept without knowing why. The first night they slept on mattresses laid directly on the floor. The walls creaked with the sound of settling, 1,000 tiny shifts of old wood learning the rhythm of new lives. Miriam couldn't sleep. She lay awake, listening to the wind, to the soft rattle of tree limbs against the window glass. Then came the sound she hadn't expected, a quiet thump from Caleb's room. She rose slowly, feet bare against the cold floor, and eased open his door. He was sitting cross-legged near the window, looking out, stood there in the doorway, hands trembling slightly. It wasn't progress, not yet, but it was something. Over the next few days they unpacked. Daniel cleaned out the barn, found an old saddle and a wasp nest the size of his fist. Miriam planted rosemary in the window boxes, even though she wasn't sure it would take. They painted Caleb's room soft green, not because he'd asked for it, he hadn't spoken a word, but because it reminded her of open fields and spring mornings. Each morning, Miriam made pancakes shaped like animals, even if Caleb just pushed them around the plate. Each afternoon, Rook lay by the window while Caleb sat beside him, sometimes drawing. Not people, not places, just lines, circles, shapes with edges and shadows, and always the mirror. It sat in a guest bathroom at the end of the upstairs hall. They hadn't touched it yet. The frame was ornate, carved oak, dark and scuffed, the glass speckled with time. Miriam had meant to replace it, but somehow, days passed, weeks, and the mirror stayed. Every so often, she'd catch Rook looking at the hallway like he was listening for something just beyond it. And sometimes, in the middle of the night, she'd hear Caleb talking. Not clearly, not in full words, but murmurs, low, like prayer or memory, always with Rook beside him. Daniel said it was just dreams. "I think the boy's starting to unwind a little," he'd said one evening, sitting on the porch, watching the sun fall into the horizon. "Sometimes it takes the silence first, the rest comes later." Miriam nodded, but didn't speak, because in her gut there was still a pressure, a knowing, the kind that settled behind the heart when something old wasn't done with you yet. They had come to the farmhouse looking for peace, but sometimes peace is a mirror, and sometimes what stares back isn't ready to let go. The rain came in slow at first, a gentle whisper against the eaves. Miriam barely noticed it until the wind shifted, that sharp Texas wind that picks up grit and memory all at once, carrying it through the trees like something hunting its name. She had been lying awake in bed, the quilt pulled up to her collarbone, Daniel already asleep beside her. The room was dark except for the faint glow of the moon through the gauzy curtains. Then came the sound she hadn't heard in weeks, a whimper, not loud, not sharp, just enough to lift her heart into her throat. She slipped from the bed, careful not to wake Daniel, and padded barefoot across the hallway. The wood was cold beneath her feet, the kind of cold that comes from old houses and unsettled air. Caleb's door was open. He always slept with it. He was. Caleb sat curled in the corner of his bed, knees to his chest, face half hidden behind the threadbare turtle he still carried like a talisman. The blanket had fallen to the floor. His lips moved soundlessly, not quite forming words, just the shape of fear. Thunder followed, not loud, but close enough to shake the windows. Rook stood at the edge of the bed, watching the boy, His ears were tilted forward, tail low but steady. He didn't bark, didn't pace. He waited. The boy shuddered again, his hands gripped tighter around the stuffed toy. And then, barely, Miriam saw it. Caleb reached out, not far, just enough for his fingers to brush against the side of Rook's face. It wasn't a pet, not yet, just contact, the way a blind person might reach for a wall in a room they no longer recognize. Rook didn't move. He didn't even blink. But after a few seconds, the dog lay down beside the bed, stretched out slowly, carefully. His body pressed against the wooden frame like he was building a barrier between the boy and the storm. Miriam didn't breathe. She felt something flutter in her chest, not joy, not quite, something gentler, more fragile. Caleb's hand fell from the dog's head and rested against the blanket, but he didn't pull away. And then he lay down, quietly, turned on his side, facing the dog, and closed his eyes. It was the first time she'd seen him sleep without a light on, without waking every 30 minutes from dreams he never explained. Rook stayed motionless, guarding, listening. Miriam stayed in the doorway until the next lightning flash passed without stirring the boy. Then she leaned back against the frame, her hand pressed to her chest like it might still the ache. She wasn't a stranger to pain, not anymore, but hope. Hope was different. Hope crept in like dawn, and that night it curled itself on the floor of her son's room, wore fur and scars, and didn't make a sound. She tiptoed back to her own bed, climbed in slowly. Daniel stirred. "Everything okay?" She didn't answer right away, just lay still, staring at the ceiling. "He touched him," she whispered finally. "Rook." A pause. Then soft. "Good." And it was. Because for the first time in months, Caleb slept through the night, no crying, no pacing the floor, no silent screaming into a world that refused to answer. Just breath, steady, and adult towels, her mind elsewhere, when the sound stopped her cold. She tiptoed to Caleb's room, careful not to let the old floorboards betray her, and peeked through the door. He was sitting on the rug, knees folded, one crayon clutched in his small hand, though there was no paper in front of him. Rook was lying beside him, eyes half-lidded, breathing deep and slow. The humming came in waves. Caleb leaned against Rook's side, his head barely brushing the dog's ribs. And every time the boy paused, Rook's ear twitched, and the song would start again. Miriam didn't move, didn't speak. She knew better than to interrupt something sacred. From that moment, the rhythm of the house began to shift. Rook became more than just a presence. He became a shadow stitched to Caleb's every step. Wherever the boy went, Rook followed. If Caleb wandered out to the back porch, Rook padded beside him, lying down just far enough to give space, but close enough to intercept a storm. If Caleb sat under the oak tree near the barn, Rook circled once, then lay in the dirt, facing outward, watchful. The dog never hovered, never intruded, but he never left. It was protection without pressure, companionship without demand, and slowly, in the quiet, something grew. Caleb began reaching, not just physically, but emotionally, though still in ways most wouldn't see. He started to leave his room in the mornings before being asked, started to linger longer at the breakfast table, holding his spoon, even if he didn't eat right away. Once, he even took a bite of pancake in front of them, didn't swallow it, but let it rest on his tongue like he was testing the weight of permission. Miriam and Daniel said nothing. They didn't cheer or applaud or make it a moment, because trauma didn't respond to noise. It responded to trust, and trust had 4 legs and a black saddle of fur. One afternoon, Miriam came in from the garden and found Caleb asleep in the hallway near the bathroom. His cheek pressed to Rook's belly like a heartbeat was the only lullaby he needed. Rook didn't even lift his head when she approached. He just blinked slowly, then closed his eyes again. That night, after Caleb had gone to bed, Daniel sat on the porch steps with a cup of lukewarm coffee and stared out at the dark pasture. The crickets were loud. The wind had settled. "Do you think he remembers?" he asked. Miriam looked up from where she sat beside him. "Who?" "Rook." Daniel nodded toward the screen door, where the dog lay curled near Caleb's door, like a sentinel. "Do you think he remembers everything from his police days?" She considered it. "I think he remembers enough." Daniel's jaw tightened. "It's like he knows something we don't, like he's reading the house, or Caleb, or both." Miriam took a slow sip of tea, her hands Daniel finished. Neither spoke for a while. Then Daniel said, "I looked it up. His unit, when Rook was active. They used him in a lot of missing persons cases, runaways, abductions." Miriam's stomach turned, but she said nothing. "He's found kids before," Daniel added. "Maybe that's what he's doing again." Inside, a floorboard creaked, then silence, then the unmistakable thump of a tail, Rook's tail, against the wooden floor. Miriam looked at her husband. Daniel smiled faintly, the kind of smile people wear when something bigger than them is taken over. "That dog's working again," he said. "Yes," Miriam whispered, "but not the way he used to." The next morning, Caleb followed Rook out into the backyard. The boy carried a piece of string in one hand and the turtle in the other. He didn't speak, but as he sat in the grass, he looked up at the sky, tilted his head like he was listening. Then he hummed 3 notes. Rook lay down beside him, and Miriam, watching from the kitchen window, pressed her fingers against the glass and let the ache in her chest swell, not from sorrow, but from something she hadn't dared feel in a long time, something like grace. It started as pacing, nothing loud, nothing dramatic, just the quiet, repetitive sound of claws tapping the floor upstairs, usually after dusk, once the house had settled into its nightly hush. At first, Miriam thought Rook was restless. Some dogs needed more movement as they aged, joints stiff, instincts still sharp. But this wasn't that. This was focused. Every night for 3 nights in a row, Rook climbed the stairs alone and lingered at the end of the hall, right in front of the guest bathroom, the one no one used, the one with the tall wall-length mirror framed in dark wood so old it looked like it had grown roots into the plaster. Rook would stop in front of the door and pace, back and forth, 5 steps each way. His nails would click against the floorboards, then fall still as he sat in front of the door, watching it, not sniffing, not curious, watching, like he was waiting for something to make the first move. The 4th night, Miriam followed him, quietly, barefoot, holding her breath like a trespasser in her own home. She stood at the end of the hallway, the soft light from the nightlight in the outlet casting Rook's shadow long across the floor. He was sitting again, ears angled forward, tail stiff along the wood, no wag, no shift of posture, just stillness, tense, hard-edged. Then came the sound that made her skin prickle, a whine. It left his chest like a thread unraveling, low and reluctant. Not pain, not even fear. Something else, something closer to dread. She reached a hand out, called softly, "Rook." His ears twitched, but he didn't look back. She took a step closer. Breath caught in the middle of his chest. He was staring straight at the mirror through the half-open door. Miriam followed his gaze. It was the same as it had always been, just a mirror. A little dusty, a faint smear near the corner from the last time she cleaned it. A crack in the left corner, so small it barely showed unless the light hit it just right. She watched their reflections, hers and Rook's, blurred slightly by distance, by darkness. Something about it made her throat tighten. "Come on," she whispered, tugging lightly on his collar. "Come downstairs." He didn't resist. But he looked back once as they walked away. That was when she started watching Caleb more closely. And that was when she noticed he never went near the bathroom anymore. It was subtle at first. He'd pause before passing the top of the stairs, then take a wide arc around the doorway. Once, when Daniel asked him to grab a towel from the hallway closet near the bathroom, Caleb froze in place, shoulders rigid, fingers trembling. He didn't scream, didn't cry, just stood there like he'd turned to stone. Later that same evening, the faucet upstairs turned on by itself. At least, that's how it seemed. Miriam had been in the kitchen. Daniel was outside mending the fence. Caleb was coloring at the table, Rook asleep at his feet. Then came the sound of water, steady, running. She glanced up toward the ceiling, heartbeat skipping. "Daniel?" she called. "Are you upstairs?" No answer. She climbed the stairs, slow and deliberate, Rook following this time with his head low, posture tense. The bathroom door was ajar. The light was off. The water was running. She stepped inside and flipped the switch. The faucet was on full, sink nearly brimming. The mirror was fogged. She reached out, turned the handle tight. The sudden silence made her ears ring. Rook let out a single sharp bark, loud in the small space. Then silence again. That night, Caleb wouldn't eat, wouldn't hum, wouldn't meet her eyes. Miriam tried to comfort him, kneeling beside him with soft words and gentle hands. He only stared at the table, hands clenched in his lap. When she reached out, he flinched. Not from her, but from the sound of the upstairs toilet flushing, even though no one was up there. Rook shot up from the floor and growled, a low, guttural sound that sent chills down Miriam's spine. Daniel went up to check, flashlight in hand. Nothing was out of place. But Rook wouldn't leave the stairs. He sat at the top for hours, refusing to move. From then on, Miriam began calling it the ritual. Not out loud, not to Daniel, but in her mind. It was coming from upstairs, not frantic, not random, deliberate, like paws on tile. She got up, slipped down the hallway, and paused at Caleb's door. He was asleep, clutching Rook's tail with both hands. The dog lay stiff beside him, eyes wide open, ears turned toward the hallway, waiting, listening. Miriam didn't sleep the rest of the night. By morning, the silence had returned, but the mirror stayed fogged, the faucet stayed cold, and Caleb began to draw mirrors in his notebook, small ones, cracked ones, always with shadows just beyond the edge, always with Rook nearby, as if the dog were the only thing keeping the shadows from stepping through. By late afternoon, the light in the farmhouse turned the color of old paper, soft and yellowed at the edges. Dust hung in the kitchen air like idle thoughts. Miriam rinsed apples at the sink and listened to the small sounds that had become the measure of her days. The tick of the clock, the whisper of wind through the cedar, the soft thud of Rook's tail against floorboards whenever Caleb moved. Crayon shavings speckled the table. Red curls, gray grit, a smear of charcoal that wouldn't come out of the wood grain no matter how she scrubbed. Caleb worked there most days now, not with the bright, easy colors other children reached for, but with the muted box. Graphite, slate, bruise blue, a red so dark it bled toward brown. He hunched close to the paper, his small hand gripping the crayon so hard his knuckles blanched, humming that little not-quite melody that lived somewhere between a lullaby and a wound. Rook lay sprawled under the chair, chin on his paws, eyes half closed but never fully gone. Every time Caleb dragged the crayon across the page with a hard, purposeful line, one of Rook's ears flicked, as if the sound drew up a memory even he couldn't name. At first the drawings were shapes, ovals nested inside larger ovals, rectangles inside rectangles, thick borders that boxed in a blank center. Then came the darker ones, a square with hatch marks for a ceiling, the suggestion of a single bulb, dangling and cracked, walls shaded until the paper buckled. Always a rectangle in the middle, heavy frame, a harsh unlit window inside a room with no windows at all. A mirror. Miriam told herself it was coincidence. Children draw what they see. The house had mirrors. The guest bath had the biggest. Still, when she passed behind him to wipe the thick kind, he didn't answer. He reached past the box for the graphite stick and sketched 5 small ovals inside the frame, each connected to a narrow line of a body, each with eyes that were only empty circles, no pupils, no shine. He shaded the eyes until they became holes. Rook's breath shifted, a slow inhale, a slower exhale. The dog slid one paw forward, not quite touching Caleb's shoe. Miriam set the towel aside and moved closer, careful not to cast too much shadow across the page. She had learned these last months how easily a well-meant shadow could change the temperature of the room. "What is it?" she asked, keeping her voice level, a soft place to land. Caleb pressed the red up the side of the frame, then paused, almost tenderly, and began to draw another figure outside the 5. Larger. The lines were thicker, the head too big, the shoulders square. The body didn't connect right. He was not like the others. He was near the mirror, but not in it. The red bled across his arms. Without thinking, Miriam reached to switch on the lamp over the table. The room had dimmed toward evening, and the farmhouse had a way of gathering darkness earlier than it should. Her fingers found the chain, gave it a gentle tug. "Don't," Caleb breathed. So soft, so sudden. Not a plea, a rule. Miriam froze, the chain cold in her hand. Rook lifted his head fully now, watching the boy, watching Miriam, the gold coins of his eyes catching what little light there was. "Okay," she said, letting the chain fall still. "No light." Caleb went back to the page. The humming returned, narrower now, more precise. He printed letters carefully at the top, blocky and small, as if he'd learned them alone. U.S. Miriam felt something hollow open in her chest. "Us," she whispered. The word tasted like dust. He stopped. He didn't look at her. He pressed the graphite into the hollow eyes and filled them darker still. "Who is us, honey?" she asked. She crouched, trying to make herself smaller than the table. "You and—" He slid the paper sideways before she could finish, started a new page with the same rectangular frame, a same room that seemed to exist somewhere his hands already knew. This time he drew the bulb, a circle with a crack through it. He shaded heavily around the edges so that the center looked like breath on winter glass. Rook stood and stepped forward, easing his weight so the chair wouldn't scrape. He nosed gently at the edge of Caleb's wrist, not pushing, just present. The boy did not move his hand away. "Caleb," Miriam tried again, keeping her voice barely above the hum. "Who are they?" "Graphite, point, tap, 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 tap." Then, almost not touching, the red figure. He didn't say that name, he just pressed the point to the paper until it broke. He flinched it to snap. Rook made a sound, low, not quite a growl, more like a warning meant for air. Miriam gathered the broken graphite without thinking, the dust blackening the whorls of her thumb and forefinger. "We can fix that," she murmured. Caleb slid the drawing aside and went to another, one she hadn't seen. He must have tucked it beneath when she was at the sink. This one was rougher, the lines too fast. The mirror frame was drawn over and over, lines doubling, crippling, until it was a dark doorway instead of glass. Inside, the 5 small figures again, closer together. Their eyes were larger. One had a small triangle of hair, one held a circle in its hand. The big red figure stood to the side, arm extended, as if he were removing light from the room. The word at the top was the same: "Was." Miriam had to sit. She pulled out the chair across from him and lowered herself into it, as if the act required more muscle than she owned. Quietly she said, "Do they have names?" Caleb's shoulders rose and fell like a shrug cut short. He reached for the dark red crayon, turned it in his fingers, as if considering whether it belonged on the table at all. "What happens when the light is on?" she asked. Do you feel better?" He shook his head. A small, quick motion, a no learned in places where no was cheaper than breath. "They don't like the light," you said again, and this time his voice slipped back toward silence, a whisper inside his hum. Rook stepped closer and lowered himself to the floor, body curled against the boy's shin, as if to remind them both that a warm, solid thing still existed in the room. By evening, the table was a scatter of mirrors, some small, some larger, the same room repeating with slight changes, as if Caleb were searching his way through memory by drawing different doors. In one, the bulb was bright, and the 5 figures had turned their backs. In another, the bulb was gone, and the frame seemed to shine with its own dim, impossible light. No windows, no exits, just the echo of a space too well known. Miriam gathered the finished pages with trembling hands and slid them into a manila folder. She told herself it was to keep them neat, to keep the wax from smearing, but when she labeled the tab, her hand wrote Caleb drawings, and then, without thinking, bathroom. The word sat there, small and unreasonable. After dinner, apples sliced, toast untouched, Caleb drifted toward the stairs and stopped at the bottom step. He peered up into the hall the way a child in a story looks into the forest. Caleb's hands clenched, his throat worked. Miriam stepped between them. "Not tonight," she said, and something in her tone made Daniel look at her and see what she'd seen on paper. Later, when the house was mostly dark and the wind had settled, Miriam stood in the bathroom doorway, alone. She didn't turn on the light. The mirror held the shape of her and Rook behind her, ghosted in the dim. Up close at the lower left corner, she saw the thin white scratch again. Not a crack, not quite. A seam. She touched the glass. It was cold. Behind her, from Caleb's room, came the low thread of humming. Above it, a whisper like a secret sent only to the dog. A single word she could not catch, but Rook did. His claws clicked once in the hall, then stilled, as if he'd taken up a post he remembered. Miriam let her hand fall from the glass. In the morning, she told herself she would clean the mirror, a simple thing, a cloth and a spray, and the ordinary insistence of lemon and ammonia. She would do that, and the house would be only a house again. From the doorway, the mirror watched her leave. Down the hall, a small voice, the one she'd waited months to hear, breezed into the quiet. "They don't like the light." The barking came just after midnight, a hard, chest-deep burst that split the quiet cleanly in two. Daniel was up first, old habit from years of firehouse calls, feet on the floor before his mind had caught up. Miriam followed barefoot, pulse already in her throat. The house held its breath as they climbed. At the top of the stairs, Rook stood in the hallway, head low, tail rigid, fixed on the guest bathroom as if it had just moved. He barked again, once, then switched to that terrible sound Miriam had learned to dread, a low, teeth-on-iron growl, steady as a wire. The bathroom door was ajar. No lights, no water running, just the shape of the mirror in the dark, an oblong of deeper black. "Rook," Daniel warned, gentle and firm together. The dog stepped forward, put a paw over the threshold, then began to scrape, deliberate, rhythmic strokes of nail on tile, like he was trying to pull something forward by sound alone. Each scrape rang in the small room, a bright, cold noise that made Miriam's stomach clench. "Hey," Daniel said, moving in, hand out. "Enough." Rook stopped, but his eyes didn't leave the glass. Behind them, a whisper of fabric. Caleb stood at the end of the hall in his too long pajama shirt, the stuffed turtle crushed to his chest. He didn't make a sound, but Miriam felt the air change the way it does when someone says a name. She went to him, crouched, pressed a palm to his back. "It's okay." Through his nose. "We're replacing that thing tomorrow," he said, not looking away from the glass. "I'll pick up a new mirror in town, something simple." Miriam nodded, then shook her head, both truths colliding. "Maybe it just needs a good clean," she said, hearing the flimsy in her own voice and wanting it anyway. "It's old, it's grimy, it's—" A droplet tapped metal. They all turned. The faucet was off, the sink was dry. The sound had come from somewhere inside the room, but there was nothing to see except their reflections and the dark line of the scratch. Caleb pressed closer to Miriam without speaking. Rook's ears flicked once, then settled forward again. They herded everyone back to bed with the careful choreography of parents who know any wrong step will cost them the night. Daniel sat in the hallway for a long time, with a book he didn't turn. Rook settled, finally, outside Caleb's door. Miriam lay awake and watched the ceiling until the black gave up and let morning in. By 8, she'd decided on the cleaner. The caddy from under the kitchen sink lived a humble life of lemon spray, crumpled microfiber cloths, a bottle of glass solution with a crack cap. She carried it carefully up the stairs like a small offering, the plastic bottles knocking quietly together. Rook lifted his head from his post beside Caleb's bed, watched her pass, then rose with the slow inevitability of a tide, and followed. "Just to shine it," Miriam told him without turning. She felt ridiculous speaking to a dog about housekeeping, but saying it made the act feel more ordinary. No big deal. In daylight, the bathroom looked almost friendly. The tiles were a cheerful green that had lost the argument with time. Sunlight found the old grout and laid itself down in squares. The mirror, though, held the light differently. It seemed to keep it rather than bounce it back. Up close, Miriam saw her face in it, tired, grain-dimmed, and the smear from last week's half-hearted swipe with a wet towel. The scratch in the corner looked like a stray hair trapped under glass. She shook the bottle. The marble inside rattled. Rook stepped beside her, shoulder against her knee. "I'm wiping a mirror," she said, the words too bright. "That's all." She spritzed once. Rook lunged. Not teeth, not aggression. The frantic, panicked urgency of a dog who sees a hand reaching for a hot stove. His paw struck her wrist, and the bottle clattered to the tile, spinning, solution fanning across the floor in a citrus starburst. He put both paws up on the vanity, nails scrabbling for purchase, body between Miriam and the glass. A sharp staccato bark burst from him. 1, 2, 3, then a whine that scraped bone. "Rook!" Daniel's voice from the hallway, startled, moving, turtle's seam, eyes steady on the mirror. His humming started as a thread and thinned to nothing. "Buddy," Daniel said, stepping in, palms out to show he carried nothing. "It's okay." Rook didn't look at him. He pawed at the cabinet again, nails catching the runner of the drawer hard enough to bite wood. His chest hammered the edge of the vanity. When Miriam reached for the cloth, he swung his head toward her and bumped her hand away with his muzzle, not gentle, not mean, insistent. Miriam froze. Something inside her lifted its head. She straightened slowly, cloth hanging from her fingers, and met her own eyes in the glass. The woman looking back looked like someone who had learned the weight of quiet the hard way. The woman looking back looked like she already knew the answer. "Okay," she said to Rook, to Caleb, to Daniel, to the empty air that listened. She set the cloth down. Her voice surprised her with how steady it was. "Okay." Daniel held his hands out, stilling the dog by tone more than touch. "We can take it down," he offered, shape-shifting quickly into the practical. "We don't even have to replace it yet. I'll just pull it and patch the wall. We'll figure it out." Rook stepped down from the vanity but didn't leave. He stood close enough that his breath fogged a faint crescent against the glass. Miriam watched it bloom and vanish. She thought of the drawings downstairs, the rectangle, the dangling bulb, 5 little heads with hollow eyes, the large figure inked in red like a wound that wouldn't close. She looked at Daniel. "It's not just a mirror," she said. The words came quiet, but they landed with weight. "It's something else." Daniel didn't argue. He took that in, then nodded once. "Then we treat it like something else." From the doorway, Caleb spoke in the smallest voice hope can make. "Don't turn on the light." Miriam's throat closed. "We won't," she promised. Daniel rubbed a hand over his jaw, mind already ticking through hardware. "I'll need a putty knife, maybe a pry bar. If it's glued, we'll go slow. I don't want to tear the drywall to shreds. The studs are probably—" He caught himself, glancing at Caleb, and softened his tone. "We'll be careful." He crouched to gather the fallen bottle. Rook watched every movement, muscles still tight along his back. "Let me get the tool bag," Daniel said, standing. "If there's anything behind it, we'll see." Miriam nodded. Rook didn't move. Daniel turned toward the hall. On reflex, he reached the bathroom switch. Caleb flinched. Rook's bark detonated point blank in the small space. There, steadying themselves. Putty knife. Utility blade. A thin pry bar, polished by years of use. The stud finder that always made Miriam smile, or how it beeped at nothing useful. Rook stood to the side now, as if a line had been negotiated. He didn't sit. He watched the mirror like it might breathe. Miriam eased Caleb back a few steps into the hall. "You can stay where you can see me," she told him, hand light on his shoulder. "You and Rook both." Caleb nodded once, serious as a pledge. Daniel slipped the putty knife under the frame's edge and tested gently. The old caulk gave with a sigh, a dry peel sound like tape coming off a box that had been closed too long. He worked a few inches and stopped to slide the towel farther. Sweat gathered at his hairline, though the room was cool. "Slow," Miriam murmured. "Slow," he echoed. The mirror held. The scratch in the corner seemed to lengthen by a hair's width, or maybe that was a trick of light. Rook's breathing deepened, a metronome that set pace. Caleb hummed, barely audible. When Daniel set down the knife and reached for the pry bar, he looked up, not at the mirror, but at Miriam. "Once I crack it," he said, "we're committed." She looked at the glass, at her own small reflection beside his, at the ghost of Rook between them like a third truth. She felt the old ache in her chest, grief's cousin, fear's shadow, and she stepped forward anyway, laying her hand on the cool frame. "Do it," she said. "Let's see what's on the other side." They waited for the morning light. Daniel insisted. No bulbs, no shadows, just sun filling the hallway and touching the bathroom threshold. He set his canvas tool bag on the tile, spread a towel on the vanity to catch glass. Rook stood pressed against Miriam's knee, holding still. Caleb stayed in the doorway with his stuffed turtle, humming softly. Daniel scored the brittle caulk with a utility blade, then eased a putty knife under the mirror's frame. "Not yet," he told Miriam when she offered to help. "If it's glued, it might pop." Rook's ears tipped forward. Caleb's humming faltered. The mirror was heavier than it looked. When he found a seam, the wall seemed to sigh. He spotted 2 hidden clips, unscrewed them. Third, Rook's paw pressed his wrist, a wordless warning. Daniel nodded, pocketed the screws, and stepped back. "Tomorrow," Miriam said, though they both knew better. The next morning they came prepared. Gloves, masks, a flashlight. Caleb stood in the hall with Rook against his leg. Daniel backed out the last screw. The panel sagged and released air trapped longer than any of them wanted to imagine. Damp, sour, cellar cold. Rook sneezed, then leaned in again. Daniel set the panel aside, shone the flashlight low. The space was no larger than a walk-in closet. Raw wood walls stained dark, no window or vent. A ceramic bulb socket hung shattered, pull chain ending in twine. Hooks lined one wall at shoulder and floor height. From one dangled a stiff piece of rope. A pale ring marked where a bucket had once stood. "Don't touch anything," Miriam said. Daniel's light found a small sock on the floor, pink once, with half a child's name ironed on. He set it back exactly. Then he saw it. Low on a plank, carved shallow and careful, the letter E. The beam made it sharp, undeniable. Miriam covered her mouth. No one said the name the letter offered. "Back up," she told him. "We need to call the sheriff." Daniel memorized the details, hooks, rope, bulb, and stepped out. The smell clung to him. Caleb stayed in the doorway, Rook beside him like a sentry. On the phone, Daniel's voice was steady. "We've opened a concealed cavity behind a mirror. Fixtures, ropes, hooks, a child's sock. and a carving, just an E. Miriam led Caleb downstairs. She set paper and crayons on the table. Rook settled under his chair. Caleb began to draw. A rectangle shaded with vertical strokes for planks. A broken bulb socket, chain ending in twine. Miriam's breath caught. She hadn't told him about the chain. He added 2 rows of hooks, the bucket ring, then the small carved E, exact in its angle. Last, he drew a tiny triangle on the floorboards, pressing his finger to a point on the page. "That's where she cried," he whispered. Miriam crouched. "Who?" Caleb tilted his head, lips moving without sound. Rook touched his knee, steadying him. The boy's knowledge wasn't from seeing the room that morning. It came from before. "You were there," Miriam said. He gave the smallest nod. Daniel came in, saw the drawing, and knelt. "Exactly," he said, "where the crying was." Caleb nodded. "It was cold," Miriam promised. "You don't go upstairs today. I'll tell them what the picture says." He slid the drawing toward her. "Okay," he murmured. Felt like low pressure shifting through walls. Daniel fixed the porch light, standing under it, as if brightness could guard them. Caleb slept on the couch with his head on Rook's ribs. The dog stayed awake, listening. Miriam cleared a corner of the dining table and brought out the file box marked Caleb, Adoption, only half full. Lives should weigh more than paper. She opened the agency portal, bright, polite, empty, and traced dates. Intake, September 14. Emergency removal, September 28th. Shelter care, October 2nd. First foster placement, October 10. Then nothing. 8 months gone. Next entry, June 7. Her message to the agency's support desk was professional, urgent. The reply came back chipper. Some documents may be redacted. A caseworker will respond during normal business hours. She searched the scanned PDFs again. A handwritten margin note. Emergency transfer. PL. She searched. Peter J. Lark. Foster license active 2001-2008. Address updated to 214 County Road 73. Their road. Their house. County assessor records confirmed. He'd sold it in 2009 to Daniel's uncle. A 2006 foster home monitoring report appeared. Several complaints unsubstantiated. Remove unsafe interior locks. Rook rose from the couch and lay at her feet. She printed the report and parcel record, writing, 8-month gap. October-June. Lark, Peter J., prior owner. Daniel came in from the porch. She told him, he was here. Not for a day. Months. Daniel's jaw tightened. What do? We give the detective dates, license number, parcel history. We keep him out of that room. Rook rested his head on her knee. She whispered, you knew. Caleb stirred, came to the table, put his palm on the folder. That's mine, he said. Yes, Miriam said, it's yours. She wrote a label across the tab, missing time. The next day moved carefully. Tape still barred the bathroom upstairs. Caleb sat on the rug in the front window's light, turtle in one hand, Rook stretched beside him. Daniel was in the back room, calling the detective again. Miriam wiped the table, listening to the quiet. Caleb's hand crept to Rook's shoulder. The first word came out slow. Bell. Miriam froze, not turning. "Bell," he said again. She sang, "When the man was gone." Then, Ezra, Jonah, Good, got in. Miriam asked if she could write the names down. "Okay," he said. She wrote them, reading each aloud. He touched the J in Jonah. Bell cried when the man turned the chain. "I know the chain," Miriam said. "I saw it." His shoulders eased. "The dog," he whispered. "We heard him once, not here, close. Then he was gone. After the man hit something, a crash, and then no dog." Miriam pictured rain on the curve of the road. Caleb repeated, firmer. "I stayed," Daniel said. "And now you're here." Caleb nodded. "Lila's ocean was bigger than the sky," he said. Miriam told him she thought that was true. "We'll tell the detective," she said. "Slow." Caleb agreed. She folded the paper and slid it into the folder. "If the dog stays," he added. "The dog stays," Daniel said. Rook thumped his tail once. That night, when the house was still, Caleb asleep, Rook watching, Daniel opened the laptop. He started with Miriam's find, Peter Lark, Wheeler County, emergency foster license, their address. County Archives gave him slow pages. A 2004 article, local foster parent under investigation, allegations of unsafe conditions, doors locked from outside. A reader's letter named Lark outright. Another piece, 2005, no charges filed in foster case. Complaints withdrawn. One child too young to provide reliable testimony. Corrective action, removal of certain interior locks. A 2006 sheriff's blotter listed a welfare check, County Road 73, with no narrative. He printed the articles and added them to missing time. On a legal pad, he made a column of dates. November 2004, investigation. 2005, no charges. 2006, welfare check. 2009, sale. He boxed October, June. The skepticism he'd carried, the voice that said maybe it was just a strange room, gave way. The line of history ran clean, from a name to a house to a wall to a carved E. The kettle muttered. Miriam came in, hair pulled back, tired. He slid her the printouts, right in the middle of the months they took out of his story. She read with one hand braced on the table, then looked to the living room, at their son asleep, Rook keeping a watch that was patient as water. Daniel poured tea. The thought came without warning, shaped by a night of dates and proof. "What if Rook's not just protecting Caleb?" he said quietly. "What if he's solving the case?" They arrived just after 9, 2 White County SUVs and a van marked Forensic Services in quiet letters. Dust lifted, shimmered along the pasture fence, then settled. Sheriff Mayfield stepped out first. Broad-shouldered, weather-browned, a man the county had made on purpose. Brought case boxes filled with matchbook-sized evidence tents, swabs, scales, paper bags with strings. "Morning," Mayfield said. "We'll stay out of your way as best we can." Upstairs, yellow tape stretched across the bathroom door. Rook lay on the top stair, perfectly still, eyes fixed on the doorway. Mayfield glanced at him. "Retired?" Daniel nodded. "He used to work. He still does." Shore photographed the threshold, the jam, the ambient light. Miriam stood in the hall with Caleb pressed against her hip, his hand in Rook's fur. He stayed silent, watching. Inside, Shore's lens found smoke-dark wood, broken socket, hooks not meant for coats. Her hand trembled once, then steadied. She called out findings: rope end, no window, no vent. Evidence tents appeared. By a child's sock, a brown ring where a bucket once stood, a carved letter in the planks. Swabs brushed the hooks, chain, and worn wood. Mayfield studied the room, jaw tight, eyes noting nail heads, scrape marks. the way the wood had been smoothed by skin. Miriam handed over printouts on prior owner Peter J. Lark. Unsafe interior locks, no charges. Shore bagged the sock, then lit the carved letter obliquely. Caleb finally spoke, voice quiet but certain. "They're still here. Belle, Ezra, Jonah, Lila. They don't like the light." No one argued. Shore kept the tripod dark. Daniel's hand found Miriam's. The team moved with quiet precision, sketches, measurements, paper bags filling with ends of air. Mayfield promised Caleb a quiet deputy in the hall and posted the yard to keep gawkers away. By late afternoon, Rook rose and padded toward the basement. Caleb followed without a word. Shore's flashlight skimmed concrete walls, a mower in the corner, a coiled hose. At the bottom step, Rook pressed a paw to a tile that clicked under his weight. Shore pried it up, revealing plywood fit roughly into a hole. Beneath, cool, damp air, the smell of old soil. Wrapped in dusty black plastic lay a small, bound shape. Everyone stilled. Shore marked it, bagged a pink ribbon scrap clinging to a thread. The medical examiner's team arrived, lifted the remains into a child-sized bag with careful hands. Caleb leaned against Rook, humming low. The next afternoon Mayfield returned, hat in hand. Dental records matched Belle Morris, age 6, missing since 2004. Caleb's voice was steady. "She's not under anymore." That evening, Rook led Daniel to the guest room closet. Behind coats, cedar boards hid a seam. Daniel pried one loose, revealing a shoebox. Inside, VHS tapes labeled in block letters, 2003 Fall, Jonah, 2004 Spring. Pulled out an old VHS player. Taped to it, a note in the same block hand. "Ask questions. No crying. Smile. Light off." Chain of custody forms passed from Shore to Mayfield to Daniel and Miriam. Caleb's voice came soft. "Don't let them make him watch." "No, son, never," Mayfield promised. Rook stood between Caleb and the bags as they left, his gaze following them until the van disappeared. Daniel replaced the loose panel, not to hide the truth, but to keep the room from feeling more broken. In the hall, Caleb traced the scar near Rook's ear. "Those are my letters," he whispered. "They won't be your name ever again," Miriam said. "Your name is yours." Rook pressed close, lending bone and breath to steady them both. The cedar wall stayed open a crack, as if the house itself needed air. And down the road, in a place of cold floors and bright lights, someone began threading those tapes into a machine. Names on spines, a case in motion, and a dog in a hallway refusing to leave his post. The AV room at the sheriff's office was small, square, and tired, a space meant for mandatory trainings, not what they were about to see. A rolling cart held an old TV and VCR. Evidence bags lay on the table, strings tied and signed in neat law enforcement script. Fluorescence hummed overhead. Sheriff Mayfield stood with his hat on a chair. Shore, the crime scene tech, checked each label before touching anything. State investigator Prieto leaned on the door jamb, legal pad in hand. An assistant DA sat in the corner, styrofoam cup in hand, looking cautious. "Oldest first," Mayfield said. Shore broke the string on Jonah, 2003 Fall, slid the cassette into the VCR, and pressed play with a steady forefinger. Static, then a dim room, plank walls, a broken socket, a mirror's dark rectangle. Off camera, a flat voice asked, "Name." The boy gave it softly, then louder when told. Shore wrote, "Voice present," prompted. Questions followed. Where do you go when you're good? What do you say when someone knocks? The boy obeyed. He didn't cry. Some children learn the lens is not merciful. Next came Bell, 2004, spring. A hum cut short. No noise. Smile. In the mirror, an adult's jaw and cuff appeared, wiping something near the baseboard. Ezra, 2005, winter. Counting. Fingers tapping knee. Coached cover stories. If anyone asks, you were at the store. Self-soothing noted. Lila, 2005. You don't need a lab to know the sound of a child you've been living with. Short tied the bag. We won't play it for the family, she said. Mayfield agreed. In the cafeteria, Mayfield told Miriam and Daniel, we heard a boy say, I didn't cry. You don't need to hear it, we'll confirm. Miriam nodded. Daniel asked, you think it's him? I do, Mayfield said, but no guesses on the record. Back home, the air felt changed. Caleb lined up acorns on the rug. Rook lay beside him, tail thumping once when Miriam entered. In the kitchen, Daniel told her, they heard a sentence she already knew. A knock, Mayfield and victim advocate Ms. Levin. Next steps, audio to lab, stills to clearinghouse, forensic interview in neutral space, no leading questions. Miriam's one demand, Caleb will never see those tapes. Mayfield promised, Levin offered a no-exposure directive. Caleb, without looking up, said Rook would come to the interview. He'll come, Miriam echoed. They handled logistics, press calls, neighbor curiosity, what to tell the school. Language shifted upstairs instead of bathroom because Rook growled otherwise. That night, Prieto called. Audio sent, federal task force looped in. We'll take the weight, he told Miriam. You hold your boy. Morning brought unmarked sedans and a white box truck. Lead agent Harrigan promised to keep Caleb's rules. Inside, a folding table, county and regional maps, pins marking missing, recovered, and no status. Agents photographed ordinary objects, knowing they often confessed more than unusual ones. Rook never left Caleb's side, rising only when certain words were spoken. Agents learned quickly. By midday, Harrigan was jotting case locations across Texas and Louisiana. Prieto arrived with early lab notes. Analysts froze frames, extracted the coaching voice into waveforms. Calls came from New Orleans, Shreveport, cases reopened, names matching those from the tapes. A yellow pin went in for Lila. Mayfield signed releases with steady patience. Miriam moved through the house with quiet grace, keeping coffee cups filled, apples sliced, power strips supplied. By late light, Harrigan gathered them. 2 more names matched, 3 similar sites found, cold cases reopened in a dozen counties and parishes. It means your dog and your boy cracked something welded shut, Prieto told Daniel. Rook rested his chin on Caleb's knee. A courier brought a thicker report. Voice print matches strong enough for warrants, patterns clear. Harrigan spread the pages. Miriam saw dates overlapping her own notes labeled missing time. An agent told her, some of these families have lived 15 years with a question mark. We might answer enough to let them sleep. Miriam thought of the letter she had wished for, and of the one she now wrote in her head. We heard your child. She noticed light catching Rook's scarred ear. The realization came slow, but Rook didn't just save our son. She said it aloud. Harrigan only nodded, placing another pin on the map. Evening came. Windows dimmed, guest room glass covered to block unwanted cameras. Mayfield reported more cases being reclassified, bulletins issued. Ms. Levin promised counselors for every call, answer or not. Caleb's pencil finally moved, drawing a cracked open door, light spilling through, 5 figures behind it, the dog in front. When the house thinned of people, Miriam and Daniel stood on the porch, listening to the field reclaim the day. In the window, the map glowed, a constellation stitched by strangers who had chosen to be less strange. Rook pressed between them. Caleb leaned into him from the doorway, sketchbook under his arm. They heard us, Caleb said. Yes, Miriam replied, touching the dog's scar with 2 fingers. They did. The house settled into quiet the morning after the maps. The federal cars were gone, the folding table put away, and a hush lay over the rooms. Miriam brewed coffee and left the kettle for cocoa. Rook dozed near the radiator, ears half-cocked. At the table, Caleb cupped cocoa without drinking, steam leaving a ring on the napkin. He picked up a pencil and pressed 4 block letters into the dry corner. S-H-E-L. Miriam's voice was careful. What does that say? She's still hiding, he whispered, eyes shifting to the basement door. Daniel came in from the porch. Without barking, Rook moved to the door, nose to the jamb. Daniel took the flashlight. No lights, just this, he promised. Caleb stood with a hand in Rook's fur, following down the stairs. The basement smelled of cool concrete. Past the mower and coiled hose, Rook stopped at a swollen pine cabinet. Daniel and Miriam eased it aside, revealing a thin plywood panel, nailed in place and painted to blend in. Rook pressed a paw to the corner. Daniel pried the edge loose. The panel flexed, nails popping. A narrow cavity appeared. Inside, black plastic folded and taped. The sided, a faded strip of pink cloth. Caleb whispered, "Shell." Miriam's voice was steady. "We call." Daniel phoned Sheriff Mayfield, who arrived minutes later with crime scene tech Shore and the medical examiner's team. Caleb reminded them, "No light." Mayfield echoed it. Rook lay across the opening until the team gathered. Shore photographed the seam, panel, and contents, tagging the cloth as evidence. Dr. Klein knelt and with her partner lifted the taped bundle intact. The smell of long storage rose. They laid it on a sheet. Alton, last seen in 2005. Miriam sat heavily. Daniel gripped a chair. Caleb stood at the window with Rook's head under his palm. Mayfield added, "Her aunt said she always hated the word missing. She'll hate found less." On the porch, Miriam whispered the name so the house could hear it. Shelby Alton. Morning brought a calmer quiet. Caleb sat by the window, Rook against his side. When Miriam offered apple slices, his apple came steady. Daniel came in from the porch, nodding to the boy and dog. Ms. Levin arrived with muffins, saying Dr. Pierce could see them next week, dog included. Caleb, without looking up, said, "He comes." Caleb drew on yesterday's page, an oval, another, then a line between. "She's not hiding anymore," he said. "Rook let her out." Miriam knelt beside him. "You both did." Daniel laid a hand over theirs. Caleb spoke names, Belle, Ezra, Jonah, Leela, and finally, Shelby. She was hiding. Not now. When he asked to go outside, Daniel agreed. They stepped into sun and wind. Caleb stood at the edge of the rye. "Big," he said, smiling, "bigger than the sky." Miriam sat in the grass, hand on Rook's scar. "You carried what we couldn't hear." Rook blinked slow. From the porch, Levin and Daniel watched. "He's talking," Daniel said. Caleb touched his forehead to Rook's. "We're okay. You let her out." They went back inside, the house lighter now. Miriam poured cocoa. Caleb looked up, steady-eyed. "Can we take the dog to see Dr. Pierce?" "We can," Miriam said. Rook thumped his tail once and rested his head on the boy's knee, paid in the only currency he'd ever wanted. company and the truth. The letter came in a heavy cream envelope, sealed by hand, a gold star pressed into the return address, Office of the Governor, Child Protection Initiative. Miriam paused at the mailbox, sun on her forearm, the hinge singing its one-note song. Rook waited at the bottom step, head cocked, reading the air like old shepherds read weather. She slit it open with her butter knife for important things. The thick paper carried simple words. Thanks for aiding multiple cold case investigations. An offer to plant a memorial tree at the farm. A special collar tag for Rook, voluntary on their terms. Daniel leaned on the counter, nodding at "on your terms." Caleb turned the last page of his sketchbook. 5 closed doors, 1 open. Rook brushed his knee. We can plant it by the big gate, Caleb said. Caleb dropped handfuls of soil for Belle, Ezra, Jonah, Lila, Shelby. Rook pressed a paw beside his prints. When the tree stood straight, they watered it carefully. Conrad opened a wooden box holding the silver dollar tag, Rook, Guardian and Hero, State of Texas. Daniel buckled it to the collar. Caleb held it like a sacrament before fastening it. Rook stood still. Caleb pressed his face into the fur, murmuring just words that eased the dog's breath. The plaque read, "For the children who were hidden and the dog who found them." Miriam's tears came gentle as good rain. People lingered before leaving quietly. The oak stood small but sure. Caleb traced the tag. "Guardian," he said, "and Hero." Rook rested his head on the boy's shoulder. At the county fair, the air smelled of kettle corn and cut hay. Caleb's drawing hung in the children's art show. A mirror framed in heavy lines. 5 children inside, each with a token. In front stood Rook, ears easy, body steady. The caption, "Rook showed me they were still there." Visitors paused, some openly, some pretending to move on. "Well, that dog," a woman murmured. When the blue ribbon was announced, mirror with 5, Miriam let out a quiet, "Oh." The art teacher pinned it to the frame. "For you and your friend," she told Caleb. "He did," he said. The librarian asked to hang a copy in the children's room. "For the ones who need to stand and look a while." Miriam said yes without hesitation. On the way home, the ribbon trembled in the truck's motion. They stopped at the live oak. Caleb set the drawing in the grass, knelt so his eyes lined up with the picture's mirror and the real tree. "They're waving," he said. Miriam's hand found Rook's scar. "It's true," Caleb whispered. "He showed me." One late afternoon, Rook drifted near the barn. He stopped at a patch of newer boards, placed a paw on the lowest plank. Caleb tapped, hollow. Daniel crossed from the fence, palm against the seam. Miriam joined, the memorial tree at her back. "Let's do it careful," Daniel said. He pried the boards loose. Cool air slipped out, smelling only of wood and dust. Behind was a shallow cupboard of old lumber, cobwebs, baling twine faded to the color of weather. Empty. "There's no one left," Caleb said. They'd call it in, so the record showed nothing remained. Caleb sat, Rook stretched beside him. "They're in the light now," the boy added. Daniel would nail the boards back honestly, the seam visible. Caleb asked Rook if he wanted to see the tree. The dog's tail answered yes. At the oak, Caleb touched the plaque, then the warm tag opened, "Never need checking again." Caleb didn't lean in. He didn't need to. He stood with his shoulder against Rook and listened to the nothing that sometimes tells more truth than noise. His face held that still watchful look he wore when he was counting without numbers. "There's no one left," he said. It settled on the ground the way a good fence post does, true, square, weight-bearing. We're done now. Daniel's fingers curled around the pry bar and let it go. He nodded, small like a man agreeing with a jury that had come back kind. Miriam set her palm on the top board and felt, beneath the rough grain, the simple fact of it. A space made once by someone who liked compartments, a habit, a pattern. And now, this time, merely wood and air. "Do we call?" she asked, out of the good manners grief had taught them. "We will," Daniel said. "We'll say what we found. We'll let them write it down that nothing is here at all." Caleb slid down the wall and sat with his knees up, like boys do when they've finished something and forgotten they are small. Rook circled once and lay on the bare earth beside him, the single wag at the boy's words flicking dust that turned gold in the slant of light. He stretched long, chin out, forelegs straight, a shield but easy now, as if the post he'd been holding had finally been relieved. Miriam crouched and brushed a bit of hay from Caleb's hair. "You sure, buddy?" she asked, "because certainty offered to a child is a gift, but asking is a kind of love, too." He looked at the opening again, and then at the live oak beyond the barn, its leaves making tiny hands in the wind. He nodded. "They're in the light," he said. "They don't have to hide anymore." "Okay," she whispered, "okay." They sat a while like that, man with his hands idle for once, woman with her knees in the dirt, boy with his palm on the warm place between a good dog's shoulders. No one rushed to put the boards back. The barn breathed with them. A fly traced a lazy circle and decided on elsewhere. In the loft, something small, sparrow or mouse, shifted and went quiet again. When they did rise, it was not from urgency. Daniel reset the boards loosely, not to deny the opening, just to keep the wind from tearing at it. He'd come back with proper nails and a plan that would make the seam honest and visible, so no one would ever mistake it for a door again. Miriam ran her hand along the grain, a benediction for wood that had been told to pretend and no longer had to. Caleb stood and dusted his palms on his jeans, the gesture an old one on a new set of hands. He glanced at Rook. "Want to see the tree?" he asked, like he'd just remembered something good. Rook answered the way he'd answered so many questions, one wag, not a flag, a yes, then pushed himself up to stand and fell into step at the boy's side. They walked the fence line slow. Miriam and Daniel followed close enough to count the rhythm of their footsteps, far enough to watch without crowding the shape of this little procession, child, dog, afternoon. At the live oak, they stopped. The plaque at the base held the sun easy, not flashing. Miriam reached for the scar near the dog's ear and found it without looking, the way you find a familiar step in the dark. "You did your work," she told him. "You stood the line." Rook blinked and lay down at the base of the tree, long body curved to the shape of the earth. He let his head rest on his paws and closed his eyes. Not in sleep, not yet. Just the kind of rest that keeps ears listening, but allows the muscles to trust the ground again. The one wag he'd offered still felt like it was hanging in the air, a punctuation mark you could lean your back against. The light went a shade more honey and began its slow work of making edges blur. The barn kept its secrets, made of lumber and nails only. The house on the hill felt, even from here, as if it had learned to stand without holding its breath. "We're done now," Caleb said again, softer, as if telling the wind so it could carry the news to whatever corners still needed it. The wind took it. The tree answered leaf to leaf. And the dog, with his scar and his watch, and his single, sufficient wag, let the earth hold him while the boy's hand stayed on his shoulder. Proof that some doors, once opened, do not ask to be checked again. By September, the house had learned a new kind of quiet, the ordinary kind, the kind that happens when mornings have places to be. Lunches were made. Shoes were found under chairs that had never learned to keep them. The live oak by the gate shook its leaves as if to wish them well. Caleb stood at the door with his backpack snug between his shoulder blades, a spiral notebook zipped inside. 4 new pencils, sharpening the smell of cedar wherever it went. Rook waited beside him in a navy vest, with patches that didn't shout, therapy dog, stitched small, a laminated card writing in clear plastic. Rook Ellis, certified companion. The collar tag that said guardian and hero clicked softly as he breathed. "Ready?" Daniel asked, as if any word could hold the whole of that. Caleb nodded. "He's coming," he said, and Rook's tail gave the single, sufficient wag that had become its own language in this family. They went together because that is how they did things now. The truck's bench seat held boy and dog like an old pew. Miriam drove, hands steady on the wheel. The rearview mirror catching the boy's profile, jaw set in a way that meant determination, not fear. She had learned to tell the difference. The school sat low and square, brick, warmed by a sun that had not yet found its temper. A banner out front held bright letters, "Welcome back, Bears." The principal met them on the sidewalk, tie loosened, palms open. Ms. Ortega from the office crouched to Rook's level and introduced herself the way you do to new co-workers. The counselor, Mrs. Phelps, held the door. Someone had taped a sign to the glass at kid height. "Quiet pause at work, thank you." Small mercies everywhere. Inside, floors shone with the kind of summer wax that makes sneakers whisper. Children's art from last spring had been left up on purpose. Bridge pieces to ease the first day eyes. In room 1A, Ms. Gaines, soft-voiced, kind-eyed, a teacher who kept a box of sharpened pencils on her desk because she believed in fresh starts, had set a low bed under a window. Not a dog bed, because school was school, but a thick mat with a blanket folded at the end. On the wall above, a small laminated card read, "Rook's Spot." The letters in blue, so they feel like sky. Rook walked in without a hurry and chose the space as if he'd been consulted. He checked the room with his nose, a respectful census, and then lay where he could see the doorway and the boy's desk both. Caleb slid into his chair, placed his notebook square, and turned to look at Miriam. He didn't need her permission. He only wanted the moment her eyes said, "I see you." She gave it. He breathed. The day began. Attendance sounded different with a dog in the room. Children said here, and then, after a pause, "Can I pet him?" Caleb learned to answer with a nod when Rook wore no vest, and a gentle "not now" when he did. Rules became easy in the mouth when love stood behind them. By snack break, half the class had settled their hands in the curve of that shepherd's neck and whispered secrets that smelled like graham crackers. Rook listened as if secrets were the world's oldest songs. Caleb's voice opened where it needed to. He raised his hand to tell Ms. Gaines that 6 + 3 made 9 because the dots on the ladybug proved it. He read aloud 2 sentences from Henry and Mudge and didn't trip over together. At art, his crayon found bright again, not rescue bright, not urgent. Mary. He drew Rook in front of the live oak and 5 small figures, waving from a field rather than a mirror, which felt right, now that the field held them too. He gave the dog too many toes. He shrugged and grinned and kept drawing. On the second day, the district nurse came with forms and a smile. On the third, Dr. Pierce met them in the counselor's room with a clipboard and anyone's mood. It will depend on care. The test, when it came, did not feel like a test. Rook heeled through a hallway while children spilled from music smelling like recorder and dust. He ignored a dropped muffin that tried to be important. He lay under a table while Miss Phelps let a book fall on purpose and did not so much as flinch. He accepted a hug from a boy who had not asked, and then gently backed away, teaching permission without saying a word. Paperwork turned to a card with a hologram. Miriam tucked a photocopy in her wallet and slid the original into a sleeve clipped to Rook's vest. "Official," Daniel said, and Rook, who had never cared for titles, accepted the way acceptance makes life simpler. They went everywhere, the way rivers go where they need to go and make their own manners. Library on Tuesdays, where the children's librarian mounted a copy of Caleb's fair drawing at kid height and left a stool beneath it. The grocery store, where an old man in a feed cap touched the brim and said, "Good dog," the way farmers say grace. The post office, where Ms. Hattie slid a milk bone through the stamp window, like government had finally remembered kindness. Church sometimes, sitting in the last pew, where the hymn, "Be Not Afraid," found a home in a boy's humming mouth. Therapy on Thursdays. Play, draw, talk. Rook threaded through the hour like a low drum, steady enough that words could walk in time. School found its routines, a reading log, a field trip permission slip, a science unit on seeds that sent Dixie cups home to sprout on sunlit sills. Caleb volunteered to hand out brushes when Ms. Gaines said watercolors today. It felt like handing out light. He raised his hand to be line leader and didn't look back every 3 steps to see if someone was coming. At recess, he ran. He came back pink-cheeked and damp at the temples and flopped under the elm where Rook waited behind the fence with Daniel, the two of them a matched set of watchers, content to be needed less every day. Words kept coming, the way creeks keep finding low ground. At dinner, he told Miriam exactly how the custodian's floor buffer sounded, like a spaceship trying to whisper, and how the cafeteria pizza bent like the moon. He asked Daniel if Screws remembered which wood they'd lived in before. He told Rook one night in the dark, "You can sleep." Rook did, which felt like a diploma. Rook was already standing when the boy sat up. Miriam learned to keep a cup of water on the nightstand and a cool cloth draped over it, and to say, "I'm here," before asking what's wrong. Most times, "I'm here" turned out to be the whole medicine. Fall ripened. The live oak thickened by a handful of leaves. The memorial plaque dulled a little, and then brightened again under Miriam's thumb. On a cool morning when the sky tinted itself blue, the color of quilts, the school held a safety assembly. The principal spoke about kindness like it was a lock you could teach your hands. He invited Caleb and Rook to stand with him only if they wanted. They did. The gym quieted in that ripple way crowds have when respect arrives. Caleb held the microphone with both hands and said, not loud, "This is Rook. He helps me listen." Rook sat and breathed. 200 children breathed with him. Life continued, which was its own astonishment. Homework, muddy shoes, a tangle of crayons under the couch that someone stepped on and someone else laughed about. Mail, a dentist appointment, was rescheduled because the fair came to town again. And everywhere, a dog's shadow moving with a boy's. Vest on, vest off. School, store, the wide, bright world. One body of courage, two hearts, the rhythm of healing, taught and retaught by an old shepherd who had learned to listen so hard that a child's voice could rest in the space he made. It began with a photograph of an ordinary afternoon, the kind you almost never take. Son rinsed the kitchen. Caleb sat at the table with a pencil in his fist, tongue set in concentration, and Rook's head rested on the boy's knee like a bookmark between pages. Miriam had snapped it with her phone because the light was behaving, and the moment felt like a small, well-made thing. That night, when the house settled into its new kind of peace, she opened the laptop Daniel had set on the counter months ago and told her she could use whenever the words outgrew her hands. She stared at the blank screen a while, listening to the quiet. Outside, the live oak at the gate traded whispers with the wind. In the living room, the dog's breathing kept a soft meter, and Caleb's door stood open as if light might need somewhere to wander. She titled the page, "The House That Listened," and wrote like she spoke when the kettle first began to sing, low, careful, honest. Not the whole ledger of what had happened, not the worst of it, just the shape of a story that could be carried without breaking. How a retired K9 came to live in a farmhouse with a boy who'd forgotten where his voice lived. How the dog taught the house to tell the truth. How the boy began to hum, then to speak, then to name doors no one else could see. How under Caleb's chair, and 12 words that felt like prayer without the weight of church. We keep going, slow, together. Thank you for listening with us. She read it aloud to Daniel, who was fixing a hinge at the kitchen door, because hinges had become a comfort to fix. He didn't say it was good. He kissed the top of her head, which was better. She clicked publish. The blue button wasn't ceremonial. Still, her hand shook a little. By morning, the post had tripped some current she couldn't name. People she hadn't met wrote in the comments like neighbors do over the fence, "I've been waiting for words like these." Someone shared it on the PTA page, someone else on a deputy wives forum. A therapist in Louisiana posted the link with 2 hands raised. A librarian wrote, "We taped this to the staff room door and cried in shifts." The numbers on the dashboard rose like the thermometer on the old porch, climbing even in shade. The email came first. Long notes and short, the kind that make you sit down before you finish reading. "My son hasn't spoken in months. He hums when he's near our old hound. Today he brought the dog a blanket." A teacher wrote, "I turned off our classroom lights for 10 minutes and just let the kids draw quietly." One boy said it was the first time the room didn't feel like a room. A woman signed Only C wrote, "I was one of those children. No one believed my whispers. Thank you for your boy's brave mouth and your dog's ears." Then the letters began arriving. Real paper with stamps that had traveled crooked across county lines, ink that bled in spots where a palm had rested too long. Daniel brought in the mail each afternoon and laid it in a stack by the fruit bowl with gentle hands, as if it might bruise. Postmarks from towns Miriam remembered from highway signs. Postmarks from places she'd only seen on baseball caps. A brown envelope from a prison ministry in Oklahoma. A postcard from a nurse on a reservation clinic. "We have a res dog like Rook. Kids tell him everything." Miriam saved the envelopes and read each letter at the table with the window open, Rook at her feet, Caleb coloring beside her, Daniel tightening something somewhere within earshot so she didn't have to feel alone with the words. Some she answered, some she only placed face down on the growing pile, hand on the paper like you might rest a hand on a shoulder. She bought a shoebox and labeled it "Thank You" with a pencil because marker looked too loud. One evening, she stepped onto the porch with a cup of tea and found a small package wrapped in brown paper and string the way uncles wrapped gifts. Inside lay a children's book, with a note tucked like a leaf. "Maybe this could be yours one day. We'd be honored to help you tell it." The return address belonged to a publisher whose catalog lived in every school library post, and who believed children would sit taller if they held this story in their hands. She read the message twice, and felt the far pull of possibility. Then she looked through the screen door, where Caleb and Rook lay together on the rug, boy on his stomach, chin in hands, dog on his side, one paw twitching, dreaming duties that no longer hurt. The live oak rustled at the gate. The plaque caught a line of light and held it. Daniel came to stand beside her, thumb sliding along the cup's rim, a question written on his face without trying to hide. She handed him the email. He read and made that soft sound he made these days when something kind found them. "It's good," he said. "They mean it." "I know," Miriam answered. She felt the yes and the no rise in her chest together like two birds sharing a sky. She stood there long enough for the tea to cool and the first star to show itself above the barn. Then she wrote back, fingers steady. "Thank you, truly. But this story belongs to them." She didn't need to name who them were. The editor wrote back with a grace that felt like a hand not withdrawing so much as letting go. "We understand. If this ever changes, you know where I am. For now, keep writing. We're reading." The post did what posts do. It traveled in directions she couldn't chart. A pastor in Denver read it into a sermon about listening without fixing. A social worker in Beaumont printed it for a staff meeting and watched 3 people close their eyes halfway through. A morning radio host, with a voice like warm gravel, called and asked if she'd talk live. She declined and sent the photo instead, and the host spoke the 12 words like a benediction over commute traffic. A podcaster came to the county fair with a mic and a plan and left with only a cup of lemonade and a long sit under the oak, understanding that some stories keep their shape better in quiet air. Parents came too, not with cameras, but with the carefulness of people who have learned how not to spill another person's pain. They asked if they could see the tree. Miriam said yes when yes felt right, and no when no did. They stood under the leaves and said names the wind took and kept. Rook lay in the shadow and accepted fingers under his chin, one at a time. Caleb showed them the tag, Guardian and Hero, as if to make sure they didn't miss the point. Letters kept coming. One from a retired canine handler. "Can travel farther than noise, if you give it a road." She kept the book offer's envelope in the shoebox too, not as a trophy, but as a reminder that doors can stay shut, gently. One afternoon, Caleb came home from school with a handout. Author Day next month. Local writers share their stories. He set it on the table and patted Rook's side without looking up. "Are we authors?" he asked, curious more than hopeful. Miriam thought of the post, the letters, the tree, the ribbon hanging crooked on the fridge. She thought of the way words had arrived when they were invited and stayed when they were asked to. She lifted her son's hand and placed it on Rook's scar, that small, bright crescent of memory. "I think we're caretakers," she said. "We hold the story for a while, Then we let it walk." Caleb nodded, satisfied with that shape. He went to the porch and drew Rook again, this time not in front of a mirror or a door, but under the live oak, where leaves fell like coins and the light didn't need explaining. He wrote in his careful print at the bottom, "We keep going," and handed the paper to Miriam like a receipt. She posted that drawing that night, with no caption at all. It found the people who needed it anyway. The next day, the mailbox held a letter with a Canadian stamp, conservative in its edges, and inside it a photograph of a boy and a dog in a kitchen that could have been theirs if snow were what lived outside. The note said only, "We're listening with you from here." Miriam sat at the table and let the quiet gather. She pressed her palm to the shoebox lid the way she sometimes pressed her palm to the oak. "This story belongs to them," she had written, and she believed it more each day, not as refusal, but as a kind of reverence. She didn't call out. She'd learned the magic arrived on its own schedule when no one tried to summon it. Rook had already chosen his place, front paws out, spine long, chin resting where the porch boards were coolest. The tag on his collar, guardian and hero, made a light, ticking sound when he breathed, a modest metronome to the end of day. Caleb came out with his sketchbook tucked under his arm like a secret, and stopped for a moment to watch the yard make its slow trade from green to gold. He wore the day's smudges, graphite on his knuckle, a whisper of paint on his wrist from art, rye dust on a knee, and the look of a boy who'd spent more hours living than hiding. He knelt beside Rook and set the book flat, then stroked the scar at the dog's ear with 2 fingers, a gesture that had become less like checking a wound and more like greeting an old friend. "You ready?" he asked. Rook's tail gave that one quiet wag as if signing a document both of them had already agreed to. Caleb opened to a blank page. He selected a yellow crayon, rubbed to a gentle wedge, and tested it, light as breath, on the corner. He drew a rectangle first, steady hand, deliberate. When the door's shape stood true, he softened the edges, rounding them just enough that the thing on the paper felt welcome rather than stern. He added a seam of light along one side, bold, bright, then lighter as it spilled outward, the way evening light does when it finds a doorway and decides to pass through. He shaded the porch boards beneath it, stroke by stroke, making the wood on the page look almost like the boards beneath his knees. Then, with a pencil, he sketched Rook in front of the door. Ears relaxed, body easy, one paw just over the threshold, as if the dog had chosen not to block anything anymore, only to keep company with it. He gave the dog too many toes again, caught himself grinning, and left them as they were. Perfection had never been the point. "What color is gold?" Caleb asked, not looking up. "That one in your hand," Miriam said, settling into the porch chair. The rope of the swing beside her creaked its contented rhyme. "And the way you press." He pressed softer, then harder, letting the crayon decide how the glow should live. He lifted the book to test it in the real light. The yellow on the page answered the evening in the pasture, a quiet call and response. "Good," he said. "That's right." Rook shifted a breath closer and placed his jaw on Caleb's sneaker. The weight of it steadied more than the shoe. Daniel came out carrying a dish towel he'd not quite set down, habit more than need, and leaned on the post. He took in the 3 of them, let a breath go, and felt his shoulders lower the way fences do after a storm when they discover they're still standing. "You drawing me handsome?" he asked. "Just him," Caleb said without apology, and Daniel chuckled like a man grateful to be left out of the onerous parts of being loved. A breeze came through the rye with a sound like a mother smoothing a child's hair. Somewhere near the barn, A sparrow made its two-note song and flew on. The porch paused, held the yellow crayon up to the sky as if checking a swatch, then returned to the page and drew the knob on the door. Small, plain, nothing you'd notice if you weren't looking. He left it without a keyhole. He knew what he was saying. His mouth moved, a little, the way it did when words were lining up before choosing a lane. "It's the last one," he said at last, not loudly, not to be brave, just to put the truth in the air where it could work. He leaned closer to Rook, his voice finding its strong whisper. "We don't have to open it anymore." Rook's ears tipped, that old working dog instinct answering even a gentle order. He blinked, slow, and offered a single thump of tail. Agreement. Oath. Amen. Then he set his head back down and let his whole weight soften into the porch, the way a sentry does when the watch changes at last. Miriam felt the sentence move through her the way warm water moves through cold hands. She hadn't known she'd been holding her breath on this, too, until it let go. She pressed her palm to her sternum, an old habit from an old life, and then lowered it to the arm of the chair, splayed her fingers against the worn grain, and let the board hold them. The skin of the evening took on that delicate pearly sheen that comes just before the first star. The house listened as if it were learning a new language it had always wanted to speak. "Draw your name," Daniel suggested from the post. Gentle nudge, not command. Caleb printed C-A-L-E-B, small, in the corner, then added, beneath the dog's paws, a single word that had taken its time finding him, and now felt simple. Home. "May I?" Miriam asked, leaning forward. When he nodded, she took the darker pencil and drew the faintest line beneath the word, not underlining it so much as giving it a floor. She handed the pencil back, and Caleb, satisfied, began to give the dog on the paper a shadow, the soft kind that makes a figure belong to its place. A pair of headlights rolled slow along the county road beyond the field, paused at the gate as if considering their business, then carried on. The world beyond the fence kept its shape without feeling like a threat. Ms. Levin would be finishing supper in town, maybe washing 2 plates in a sink that had learned the weight of her hands. Sheriff Mayfield would be on his last call, tipping his hat to a porch that smelled like tomatoes before heading home to set his boots by the door. Somewhere, Agent Harrigan's maps lay pinned and quiet, the lines no longer reaching toward this house. The work had scattered back to where it belonged. The piece into itself. "Can we put it by the other one?" he asked. He meant the fair ribbon drawing, the one by the live oak, 5 figures waving from a field instead of a mirror. Just for tonight. "We can," Daniel said, and took the sketchbook like a thing that ought to be carried with care. "I'll find a clip." He disappeared inside, the screen door granting him a dignified squeak. Miriam leaned forward and let her hand find the old scar at Rook's ear. She traced it once, not to check, not to test, just to remember the mile marker of it. Tears came, the good kind that neither threaten nor demand, that simply arrive when the heart recognizes itself in what it's watching. She didn't hide them. This porch knew the shape of all her weather and had never told on her yet. "You did it," she said to the pair of them. "Both of you." Caleb lay down on his side then, facing Rook, nose to nose, and slid one hand under the dog's collar so his fingers could feel the steady, ordinary thrum there. He smiled, not the brittle smile people made for cameras, but the one that uses only the parts of the face that are honest. "We all did," he said, "even the house." The house answered with that small, answering creak again, like a laugh trying to stay polite. Daniel came back with a wooden clip and hung the sketchbook by the door, the new drawing catching the last wash of light. For a moment, the gold on the paper and the gold of dusk nested together so completely that the porch seemed to hold a door of its own. No one moved to open it. That was the gift. They sat that way, the four of them, man, woman, boy, dog, while day did its long, beautiful work of remembering how to end. A cricket started its one-note hymn, and another joined. The air cooled just enough to make Miriam pull her sweater close. Daniel rubbed the dog's chest with his foot, the way you do when your hands are busy holding the people you love with your eyes. When the star came out above the barn, first, faithful, Caleb lifted his head. "Good night," he told it, because he'd learned some nights want telling. He pressed his face once more into Rook's fur, breathed in the smell of sun and field and the clean, warm animal that had taught him to listen, then stood. He slipped his hand into Miriam's without looking and left it there, like a boy who knows the road and chooses the company anyway. "Bed?" Daniel asked. "In a minute," Caleb said. He turned to the drawing on the wall, reached up and touched the golden door with one finger. "See you," he whispered to it, a promise that sounded like farewell, and the door, light, line, shadow, kept shining without asking anything more. Just keeping it company until the last of the day slipped past. Miriam took in the picture they made and felt something in her rearrange itself into the right shape. The long ache that had haunted the corners of rooms loosened its last knot. Peace, she discovered, did not arrive like a parade. It came like this: a boy with graphite on his knuckle, a dog with a scar that had made a promise and kept it, a door drawn gold, because sometimes the only way to honor the dark is to know it no longer asks to be opened. "Home," she said. Not to test the word, but to live in it. The porch held the syllable like a note, in a song it had finally learned, and the night, approaching with kindness, agreed. In the end, this isn't just a story about a brave dog. It's about how love settles a house, how a German shepherd's quiet loyalty can steady a child's breath, and how the space between a person and an animal can fill with something that feels a lot like grace. Dogs don't fix everything, but they stand with us while we heal. And that changes everything. If you'd like to deepen a bond with your own dog, I've put together a gentle little resource. Simple, trust-building moments and calm games you can do at home. No fuss, no hype, just the kind of things that help a good dog feel even more like family. If that sounds helpful, tell me you'd like the guide and I'll share it. No pressure, just a warm suggestion from one dog lover to another.